It happened at 2 in the morning, local time, out in the eastern desert of Jordan, at a base most Americans have never heard of. NASA's own wildfire-tracking satellites, the same system scientists use to spot forest fires from space, picked up 2 distinct heat signatures on the ground near Azraq at almost exactly the same moment. One of those heat signatures sat right on top of the personnel living quarters. The other sat next to the hangars. By the time the sun came up, U.S. Central Command was drafting a statement that would tell 3 American families their son or daughter wasn't coming home. This is the story of what happened at Muwaffaq Salti Air Base on the night of July 17th into the 18th, 2026. What Iran actually hit, what it cost, and what the United States did in response over the following 72 hours. I'm going to walk through this the way it actually unfolded, hour by hour where the record allows it, and I'm going to be clear the entire way through about what's confirmed by multiple independent sources and what's still an open disputed question. Because this particular night has already produced conflicting claims from both sides, and you deserve to know which parts of the story are solid ground and which parts aren't. Let's start with the base itself, because there's something almost eerie about its history that I didn't expect to find. Muwaffaq Salti Air Base sits out in Jordan's eastern desert near the town of Azraq. It's named after Lieutenant Muwaffaq Salti, a Royal Jordanian Air Force pilot who was killed in an air battle with Israeli fighters back on November 13, 1966, during what's known as the Battle of Samu. Jordan gave his name to this desert airfield decades ago, and it's carried it ever since. For years, it's been one of the installations the United States has leaned on most heavily to project power into the wider Middle East, precisely because its distance from Iran, compared to the big American bases clustered around the Gulf, made it a harder target to reach. That assumption held for most of this war. It stopped holding on the night of July 17th. Now here's where we need to rewind slightly, because this attack didn't come out of nowhere, and understanding the lead-up changes how you read what happened next. By mid-July, the renewed U.S.-Iran conflict was already 7 consecutive nights into a fresh American bombing campaign following the collapse of a ceasefire that had briefly held since mid-June. Iran had been responding to that campaign by striking American-linked and partner nation targets across the wider region, hitting Kuwait, hitting Qatar twice, and, as we're about to get into, hitting Jordan repeatedly. This wasn't Iran's first attempt on Muwaffaq Salti either. According to Jordanian military officials cited in open-source tracking of the conflict, Iran and Iran-aligned groups had launched well over 100 missiles and drones at targets inside Jordan earlier in the year, with multiple attempted or partially intercepted strikes on this exact base going back to March. Jordanian air defenses knocked down at least 1 missile aimed at the base as early as March 3rd. Small drone incursions were reported through the spring. In other words, this base had been in Iran's sights for months. July 17th was the night the pattern finally connected. And there's a specific reason this base, out of all the American positions in the region, kept getting targeted. According to reporting from Defense Security Asia, the July strike appears to have been the culmination of a months-long Iranian campaign specifically aimed at America's MQ-9 Reaper drone fleet. The unmanned aircraft the U.S. has relied on heavily throughout this war for surveillance and strike missions. That fleet had already been worn down badly before this night even happened. Military Watch magazine reported that at least 53 American MQ-9 Reapers had been shot down since operations against Iran, and Iran-aligned Houthi forces in Yemen began ramping up back in late 2023, a genuinely staggering attrition number for a single airframe type. Muwaffaq Salti housed a significant share of the surviving fleet's operating infrastructure. That's what made it a target worth the risk of a direct strike on a base hosting American personnel, rather than just another round of missiles at empty desert. So let's walk through the night itself. In the early hours between July 17th and 18th, Iranian forces launched a combined strike of ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones at Muwaffaq Salti. CENTCOM confirmed the attack directly, posting that Iran had conducted a retaliatory strike with ballistic missiles and drones against the base. Open-source reporting indicates at least 2 missiles impacted directly. NASA's FIRMS satellite system, again the wildfire detection network being used here in an improvised way by open-source analysts to spot missile impact heat signatures, recorded the 2 hits I mentioned earlier, one over the living quarters, one near the hangar complex. The initial CENTCOM statement, released the following day, confirmed 2 U.S. service members killed in action while defending against the attack, 1 more service member missing, and 4 additional personnel evacuated to hospital in Jordan before being treated and released. That was the first accounting. It would not be the final one. Because here's where the story gets grimmer and where I want to slow down and be precise about the timeline. Because the casualty count actually grew over the following 2 days in a way that most single headline coverage of this event completely missed. The day after the strike, in northern Iraq, a separate incident killed a further American service member and wounded another during what's been described as a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance recovered from a downed Iranian drone. A grim reminder that even after a drone is shot down, its payload can still kill. Then, on the Sunday following the attack, CENTCOM announced that search teams at the Jordan site had recovered unidentified human remains and that forensic examination was underway to determine whether they belonged to the missing service member. As of the most recent confirmed reporting, that brings the total to 3 American personnel confirmed killed connected to this specific attack sequence, with one still formally unaccounted for pending identification. I want to be very clear that this is more than the 2 killed figure that ran in a lot of the initial headlines. The full toll took days to become clear, and some early coverage never went back and updated it. Now, what actually got hit physically on that base? This is where satellite imagery has done more work than any official statement. Commercial satellite imagery captured on July 19th, published by the open source imagery provider Solar Atlas and independently reviewed by the open source intelligence group Hegseth, showed a far more extensive damage picture than initial reports suggested. The imagery revealed multiple impact sites spread across different operational zones of the base. Not one lucky hit, but what Hegseth's analysts assessed as the pattern of a large, accurate missile salvo rather than a single missile landing. 2 hangars were confirmed struck. A major impact crater was visible directly in the housing area, which lines up precisely with that firm's heat signature over personnel quarters. Multiple aircraft shelters were destroyed. A separate hangar on what's known as the base's ISR and close air support apron, the zone used for surveillance and strike aircraft operations, was also hit, suggesting Iran's targeting deliberately spread across more than one part of the base rather than concentrating on a single building. Military Watch magazine's review of the same imagery specifically identified 3 to 4 hardened aircraft shelters that had housed MQ-9 Reaper drones as destroyed in the strike, with at least 2 additional Reapers that had been parked outside hangars at the time, also showing direct damage. Iranian state media separately released its own satellite imagery afterward, claiming to show destroyed Reaper airframes sitting inside collapsed hangar structures, though it's worth flagging clearly that the resolution of Iran's own released imagery has not been independently verified to the same standard as the Western open source imagery. So treat Tehran's specific destruction claims as a still disputed data point layered on top of the confirmed structural damage everyone agrees happened. So what actually happened next? The part your title is really asking about? Within hours of the Jordan attack becoming public, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's public message was blunt. The American losses, he said, had only stiffened U.S. resolve. U.S. Central Command then launched what officials described publicly as a strike campaign meant to swiftly punish Iran for the attack. That response fed directly into the broader air campaign already running under the name Operation Epic Fury, the same bombing campaign that, in the days immediately following, expanded to include B-2 Spirit stealth bomber sorties against hardened Iranian missile infrastructure, continued strikes on bridges, tunnels, and rail links across southern Iran that severed roads leading to the Strait of Hormuz coast, and a documented 7th, then 8th, then 9th consecutive night of American strikes across the country. Iranian state media reported bridge damage in Hormozgan province directly tied to this response wave, including strikes on the Bandar Abbas-Rudan corridor, part of a strike pattern that provincial officials said had by that point cut half a dozen bridges in a single county alone. In plain terms, Iran ambushed an American base overnight, killed American personnel, and the American reply wasn't a single retaliatory strike. It was an intensification of an already running air campaign, escalated specifically because of what had just happened in the Jordanian desert. I want to pause here and give you the fair, two-sided read on what this attack actually tells us strategically, because there's real disagreement among people who study this seriously, and I don't think you're served by pretending there isn't. One read, this was a significant tactical success for Iran. It reached a base American planners had long assumed was harder to target because of its distance from Iranian territory. It inflicted real personnel casualties, and it appears to have specifically degraded an already fragile MQ-9 Reaper fleet that had been bleeding airframes for over 2 years. If the goal was to demonstrate that no American position in the region is truly out of reach, and to force Washington to absorb real losses for continuing the air campaign, this strike arguably achieved both of those things. The other read, this attack also handed the United States exactly the political justification it needed to escalate further, and it did so at a moment when Iran's own military position, after months of losing bridges, ports, coastal infrastructure, and now underground missile facilities to American strikes, was already deteriorating badly. Killing American service members directly, rather than just hitting empty infrastructure, changes the domestic political calculus in Washington in a way that favors more strikes, not fewer. Several outlets covering the aftermath noted explicitly that the deaths, combined with Tehran's separate announcement that it was suspending its commitments under the earlier ceasefire memorandum, pushed observers on both sides to describe the war as entering a darker, more dangerous phase. Not because Iran had gained the upper hand, but because both sides had just removed whatever remaining restraint had kept the conflict from becoming this direct. Here's what's still genuinely unresolved, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. The exact number of MQ-9 Reapers destroyed at Muwaffaq Salti specifically, as opposed to across the whole war, hasn't been independently confirmed at a precise figure. Different outlets are working from the same satellite imagery and arriving at estimates of 3 to 4 destroyed airframes, which is close but not identical across sources. Iran's own claimed destruction figures haven't been verified to Western open source standards, and the final, formal identification of the third American casualty was still pending as of the most recent reporting available. Any script that gives you a single confident number on any of those 3 points right now is rounding uncertainty into false precision. Let's zoom out, because I think the most important thing about this night isn't the missile count or the hangar count. It's what it represents in the arc of this war. This wasn't a random, isolated ambush. It was the culmination of a targeting campaign against a specific American capability, the Reaper fleet, that had been building for months through repeated smaller attempts going back to March, until Iran finally landed a strike big enough and accurate enough to do serious damage. And the American response wasn't proportional retaliation for a single night. It became the justification for widening an already massive air campaign that, in the days that followed, reached further into Iranian territory than almost anything since the original Operation Midnight Hammer strikes on Iran's nuclear sites back in 2025. That's the actual chain of cause and effect here. A slow-building drone attrition campaign led to one brutal night in the Jordanian desert, and that one night became the trigger for an escalation that's still unfolding as we speak. 3 American service members, a base named after a pilot who died defending Jordanian airspace 60 years ago, hit by the exact kind of attack it was built to help prevent. A drone fleet that had already been quietly bleeding losses for years finally hit hard enough to make headlines. And a war that, instead of slowing down after this, sped up. That's what actually happened at Muwaffaq Salti. As much of it as the record currently supports, clearly separated from what's still disputed. I'll be back the moment the final casualty identification or a fuller damage assessment is confirmed.